Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 7 March 2024. It is the centenary of the birth of John Greville Agard Pocock, better known to us as JGA Pocock, who was born in London on this date in 1924. Even though he was born in London, he spent much of his early life in New Zealand. He was a citizen of New Zealand, and he usually was identified as a New Zealand historian and wrote on New Zealand history. Pocock lived almost a century and only died this last December of 2023. And he was very much a working historian, as was discussed in my episode on Siegfried Kracauer, but he also wrote purely methodological papers, and he cites Oakeshott and Collingwood with some frequency. Given Pocock's work on the history of political ideas, I'm a little surprised that he doesn't mention Voegelin, who wrote an 8-volume history of political ideas. But Voegelin's broad brushstrokes, even if executed with eccentric precision, are, we could say, a world apart from Pocock's concern with linguistic particularism. So despite all the work that's been put in to bridge the disconnect between intellectual history, and some of this work by Pocock himself, which I will try to describe, a great gulf still exists between a working historian like Pocock and a philosopher like Voegelin. Pocock is often identified, along with Quentin Skinner, as the founder of the new British history, which would unify narratives of English, Scotch, and Irish history and would place British history in a larger Atlanticist context. Quote, I am arguing that British history needs to be reinvested with meaning, both because it contains areas of human experience which it would be beneficial to study, and because I have come to believe that we are doing harm to ourselves, harm to our understanding of ourselves by not studying it. But I have called it a new subject, and it should be clear from what I have said that I envision it as existing alongside English history as an old one, unquote. He suggested that historians should use Atlantic archipelago instead of the British Isles. And though that has not caught on in a big way, the method of treating British history that he urged has now become more or less commonplace. And we can see this as a part of a larger trend among historians seeking a more comprehensive context for events, which has taken us from local history through national history, regional history, world history, and to big history. Pocock is also identified as a leading exponent of what has come to be called the Cambridge School, which is known for contextualism. Representatives of the Cambridge School are said to include Quentin Skinner, John Donne, James Tully, David Runciman, Raymond Guess, and Peter Laslett. I have previously mentioned Peter Laslett in my episode on Christopher Hill, in which I quoted David Wooten as contrasting Laslett's book, The World We Have Lost, England Before the Industrial Age, and Hill's A Century of Revolution, as diametrically opposed histories of the 17th century in England. Hill's is a kind of self-insert method in which he imagines the lost communist utopia of the 17th century that never happened, but which might have happened. The contextualists would question whether what we call the communism attributed to the 17th century diggers can be meaningfully compared to the communism familiar to us from Marx and Lenin. But let me get to contextualism by way of a detour through all of the varieties of history that have been entertained. One of the things that I have had on my mind to do is to draw up a list of all the intersections between history and philosophy of history, or if you like, between history and its theory. I haven't done this in a systematic way, much less an exhaustive way, but let me try to give a sense of what I have in mind because it's relevant to Pocock's work. Recently, on my episode on Georg Simmel, we saw that Simmel used the phrase theoretical history. Theoretical history was also used many years later by the Dutch historian Jan Romein in a 1948 paper and by Othmar Anderley in a 1964 paper. Both Romein and Anderley mention Zimmel in passing, but neither acknowledge his earlier use of theoretical history. So what's the difference between history in the conventional sense and theoretical history? That hasn't, to my best of my knowledge, been spelled out. A much older term with which we can associate a great many names is historiography, which is usually understood as critical self-reflection on the task of the historian rather than reflection upon history itself. Pocock distinguishes at least 3 activities that have been called historiography. Quote, the various historians whom we denote by the term we have, in fact, been engaged in a number of different, though sometimes interconnected activities. There has been the activity of preparing a record or chronicle of contemporary events and transmitting it to posterity, perhaps for that posterity to continue and transmit it in its turn. There has been the activity of describing a past which is of importance to posterity and showing how that importance is exerted. And there has been the activity of explaining phenomena in the present by relating them to the past, of which knowledge may be already traditional or may require to be enlarged or manufactured for the occasion. The second and third of these activities, which are closely connected, presuppose knowledge of a past which is in some way important to the present. And if the first does not presuppose such a knowledge, it will soon, and in the course of transmission from one generation to another, create it. All aspects of historiography, therefore, involve awareness of a past, but the intellectual operations which they necessitate are not confined to solving problems connected with the past's true character. These operations, the social functions which they discharge, and the emotions which they become involved with, in fact, form an enormously complex and various field of study. No comprehensive history of historiography has been, or perhaps could be, written, and all writings which have been devoted to the subject have in fact been selective. The present essay will be no exception, unquote. So in addition to historiography itself, there's also a philosophy of historiography, just as there is a philosophy of history in addition to history itself. If we accept Pocock's 3 forms of historiography, then there are at least 3 forms of philosophy of historiography, consisting of philosophical reflection on each of Pocock's 3 senses of historiography. How exactly does philosophy of historiography differ from philosophy of history? And how do each differ from history proper? All of these are good questions, which is why I have been thinking about drawing up an exhaustive list of these and similar terms, along with a bibliography of their usage to try to clarify the relations between them and how these terms have been used. Or in other words, to map out the conceptual terrain of history in all its forms. Pocock tries to do just this for the forms of history and the forms of historical consciousness that interest him, though he doesn't expand this into a more general exercise or a survey of all the possibilities. For example, Pocock mentions theoretical history in passing in the first of his 6 volumes on Gibbon, but he doesn't offer any elaboration in his theoretical or methodological works for what he means by the term. Pocock also distinguishes a history of historiography that is distinct from universal history and philosophy of history. Quote, the history of universal history and philosophy of history is not coextensive with the history of historiography. As the result of the relationships which different legal and political systems had with their past, and of problems which arose within these relationships, numerous traditions of advanced historical discussion, numerous national and particular problems concerning the past and its meaning to the present, took shape during the 16th and 17th centuries, and these affected the development of historiography, which deals with particular pasts and particular problems as well as with universal ones, unquote. Yet another collection, or I should say cluster of disciplinary specializations include cultural history, which I mentioned in my episode on Karl Lamprecht, history of ideas, with Arthur Lovejoy being perhaps the most famous historian of ideas, and many others occasionally counted among their number, conceptual history, especially associated with Reinhard Koselleck, intellectual history, and history of discourses. The boundaries between these specializations can be rather fuzzy, with historians sometimes placed in one camp and sometimes in the other. Pocock's work is sometimes called history of ideas, with Pocock primarily working on the history of political ideas, but Pocock also had a critique of history of ideas as conventionally practiced. In the following quote, Pocock presents the differences between these closely related approaches to history, which he insists should not be homogenized. Quote, the formal relations between history of concepts and history of discourses will remain as I have attempted to characterize them, and there will be no reason why the two should not reinforce, stimulate, challenge, and enrich another. But it will have emerged that the two methods of study are each historically, culturally, and nationally specific, and that one cannot propose to extend either of them to each of the historic cultures of Europe in turn without learning that it is not a panacea, and that each culture indeed has its own past and its own ways of understanding it. These modes of thought can be confronted, compared, and combined, but not homogenized, unquote. So obviously, history of concepts focuses on concepts, where history of discourses tends to focus on languages. Koselleck, as I mentioned earlier, focuses on conceptual history, while Pocock, in his history of political ideas, focuses on language. And here he's influenced by 20th century linguistic philosophers like J.L. Austin, and quite considerably also by Thomas Kuhn's conception of a paradigm. Pocock places particular emphasis on what he calls political languages, which are, as he says, a complex structure comprising a vocabulary, a grammar, a rhetoric, and a set of usages, assumptions, and implications existing together in time and employable by a semi-specific community of language users for purposes political, interested in and extending sometimes as far as articulation of a worldview or ideology. It is not necessary, though it is possible, for one such language to exist by itself to the exclusion or even the domination of all others. More commonly, a number of such languages exist concurrently in confrontation, contestation, and interaction with each other. They are not, though they may attempt to be, mutually exclusive. Rather, a single complex of usages or terminology may display a character impure in the sense that it partakes of meanings drawn from several languages and sometimes non-congruent with one another, with the result that it may be difficult to isolate any concepts or an uncontested, unambivalent condition, unquote. Teasing out the meanings of language, of the language of political ideas in past contexts, is the work of contextualism, which is often simply presented as reading texts in context. The contextualism defended by Pocock and others of the Cambridge School itself ranged itself both against the devaluation of ideas in history, sometimes called modernism, and a timeless transcendence of context by ideas, sometimes called perennialism, so that contextualism was at times attacked from both sides by both modernists and perennialists. Contextualism has been called a species of historicism, but as I've said in many previous episodes, everyone has their own definition of historicism, so one shouldn't use that term unless one provides one's own definition. So it's actually a good thing that there is the term contextualism rather than assigning yet another meaning to historicism. Contextualism has been called idealist, and this is part of the critique by the modernists of contextualism. But this is only because idealism has been so watered down that the idealism in history now just means anything that isn't explicitly materialist or positivist. Collingwood's idealism represents a kind of middle ground between this watered-down idealism and the kind of full-throated idealism that we find in Hegel or F.H. Bradley, for example. Contextualism would have some interesting contexts if it were applied to Collingwood's conception of history as a history of thought. What exactly does it mean, or what ought it to mean to say that we reenact the thoughts of Julius Caesar as he led his army across the Rubicon? Is it necessary to think Caesar's thoughts in Latin? And how much Latin does one need to understand it like Caesar understood it? I don't know enough about the Cambridge School to know if any of the members of it have examined this or similar questions. But if it hasn't been worked on, this would be an interesting path to take. So it might sound like something of a stretch, but there are similarities between the problems that Pocock addresses in history and more generally the problems of the Cambridge School contextualism and the problems surrounding what's known as historically informed performance in music. Historically informed performance is an attempt to perform historical music as it was originally performed. This involves both the use of original instruments and the attempt to determine the original performance tradition when the piece was written. There are many critics of historically informed performance who have expressed their displeasure with the sound, which frequently departs from expectations. Roger Scruton, for example, was critical of historically informed performance. On the other hand, I am a real enthusiast of historically informed performances, and I am fortunate enough that the Portland Baroque Orchestra, specializing in early music, is based in Portland. I've been to many of their performances, which I thoroughly enjoy, and I've never been disappointed by the timbre or temperament of the early instruments used. We could say that the efforts of contextualists like Pocock give us historically informed concepts. It has been said of historically informed performance that it elevates musicology over music. And by the same token, one could imagine a parallel criticism such that the Cambridge School of Contextualism elevates historiography over history. Both Pocock's New British History and contextualism focuses on furnishing a context that can be and often does become lost or obscured, though in each of these cases, it is a different context that tends to get lost. Why are historians trying to or are drawn toward integrating events into an ever larger context? Context alters the meaning of an event. This is one of the lessons of Arthur Danto's narrativism, which highlights how in narrative sentences, earlier events are described in terms of later events. As consequences of a given event either grow like a snowball rolling down a hill or trickle down to nothing like a stream during a hot summer, our understanding of an event taken to be the origin of these consequences changes. The more we know about what comes later, the more we know about the future of a given event, the more we revise our understanding of this event in light of the future that it precipitated. But it doesn't end there. History seeks explanation of the present or of some past present by looking for its origins in the past. This process can always be pushed even further back into the past as we seek explanations for the conditions that were used as the explanation of present conditions. In this way, the boundaries of both the past and the future are pushed further outward in the natural pursuit of historical explanation. Pocock's contextualism, I would argue, is part of this process, but it also puts a brake on the process, since each language and each set of concepts of each era need to be taken on their own terms as part of a distinctive political language, as though history were a series of echo chambers in which only the like-minded are in conversation with each other. So happy birthday, JGA Pocock, and thanks for listening.